Written, directed, and produced by Hideo Kojima, Metal Gear Solid was released in Japan during September of 1998, and just 1 month later in the United States. Originally published exclusively for the PlayStation by Konami, this revolutionary stealth action title felt like quite a deep-cut reboot after the last two games were released for the MSX2 computer system, roughly a decade prior in 1987 and 90. Considering its reception by the global market, Kojima felt that this entry shouldn't be presented as Metal Gear 3 due to the fact that North American audiences hadn't experienced much of his franchise up until that point, with the series predominantly being published in Japan with some instances in Europe. North American gamers only had access to a below-average quality NES port of the first game and an unofficial sequel that Kojima had no involvement in. This third entry in the Metal Gear series was originally intended for the 3DO interactive multiplayer console. However, after the discontinuation of the 3DO, development was shifted to the PlayStation, with an expanded version also being produced for Windows PCs. Despite being such a large title, Metal Gear Solid only had a development team of 20 people, with only one programmer working on the game's code at the start of the project. However, Kojima claimed to enjoy working with a small team in order to better understand what everyone was working on and how well the project was proceeding. Though Kojima and the rest of the development team at Konami had little idea as to how popular Metal Gear Solid would become, it went on to sell more than 7 million copies worldwide, scoring an aggregate critical score of 94 and establishing itself as one of the most popular, most beloved, and most historically influential titles in the history of gaming. In the United States, Metal Gear Solid grossed roughly $50 million in revenue in 1998 alone, reaching roughly $100 million in 1999 combined across the United States and European markets. Let's establish why this game deserved and achieved such an impressive degree of success as we discuss what's so great about Metal Gear Solid. Available before the player begins their adventure, the main menu of Metal Gear Solid features debriefings on the events of Snake's previous missions in Metal Gear and Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake. While far too heavy with political subterfuge and military jargon to repeat in this video, the introduction basically conveys Snake's character, specific encounters with his former commander turned villain, Big Boss, as well as his ex-squad mate Gray Fox, both of whom Snake believed to have perished in the first game's setting, Outer Haven, and then fought once again in the second game's Zanzibar land. As for this entry, the events of Metal Gear Solid take place in 2005, 6 years after the plot of Metal Gear 2, in an alternate history timeline in which the Cold War continued into the 1990s. Players once again assume the role of retired Special Forces operative, codenamed Solid Snake, as he attempts to thwart a renegade terroristic threat, the Foxhound Special Forces unit, as they prepare to launch a nuclear strike using the game's titular Metal Gear device from a remote Alaskan base known as Shadow Moses Island. As can be gathered from the opening cutscene alone, Metal Gear Solid was one of the most cinematic games to be released at this point in history. Unlike most story-heavy video games up until now, there's no expansive reading for the player to do in preparation for their adventure. Everything they need to know is explained outright through some of the most professional voice acting to be presented in any video game at this time, and arguably for years to come. The game's intensive script and robust degree of voice acting was completely translated not only into English for the North American release, but also French, German, Italian, and Spanish for the European market. One of the primary pursuits of Kojima and the whole Konami team during Metal Gear Solid's development was the creation of a believable world. To achieve a tense level of realism that can enthrall the player from beginning to end, developers were exposed to demonstrations of assorted weapons, vehicles, and explosives with the help of various weapon experts and SWAT team members. The developers shared this same degree of realism with their audience without dumbing down any terminology, but instead reiterating ideas frequently enough and blatantly enough through conversations between characters that the player can easily gather what's going on despite all of the political, military, and technical jargon that one would expect to be involved in a dramatic tale of action and espionage. Anytime the player loads a save file, they'll be presented with a mission log reminding them of the events experienced when they last played. This is an incredibly beneficial feature to include in a game with such a complex plot, but more than that, it's something that not enough games do even still to this day. It's a simple and unobtrusive way to keep players invested in the story, or at least understand what they were doing between each play session. As for in-game guidance, the player is able to contact their commanding officer, Colonel Roy Campbell, alongside any other members of their advisory team by inputting that character's unique frequency in Snake's codec communicator. Any character, including some you don't recognize, can abruptly contact Snake through the codec as well, to quickly alert the player to any new developments in the story. All of the characters who are accessible for advice through Snake's codec will present information in different ways, concerning what their area of expertise is, as well as their own personality and relationship to Snake. Mei Ling will teach the player lessons through Chinese proverbs and Shakespearean quotes, while Master Miller speaks in more survivalist terms and Colonel Campbell elaborates on political and military intel. Your radio-accessible companions will explain all of the gameplay mechanics and input digestible servings of plot throughout the experience so that the player doesn't get too overwhelmed. As you come into contact with a few specific people, either hiding or taking care of their own missions on Shadow Moses Island, they may even join your advisory team after the player's first big interaction with them. However, they won't always be accessible by codec transmission, as they also have their own agenda. The limited movement and stylized portrayal of characters' portraits in the codec interface allowed the game's artists to really flex their character design. Plenty of games had amazing concept art prior to this, but other than a few instances like high-quality portraits in Final Fantasy, most characters had to be substantially limited by the pixel art or limited polygons of the 80s and 90s hardware. But the limited size of the portraits, stylized digital interface, and subtle mouth or eye movement allowed the characters to be presented in almost the same quality as their concept art, so players really got to experience these performances as intended. This interface is also so unique and efficient that it's been the standard for the majority of the Metal Gear franchise since its introduction in Metal Gear 2: Solid Snake. After some brief explanations or advice on any given scenario, the player is then left to their own devices, and can play the game however they see fit. The only limitations on the player's course of action are formed around which equipment they have access to, so even more gung-ho combat-oriented players will have to build up their arsenal through more careful planning and successful execution at least partway through the game. The three-dimensional environments found on Shadow Moses Island were designed by director Hideo Kojima using Lego bricks and toy figurines, in order to better imagine which camera angles to use in each area. This developmental system wound up translating to the game incredibly well, as each environment is fully understandable, despite how complex they are for 1998, and how freely the player can move around them. From a bird's eye view, the camera will move smoothly above Snake without obscuring anything that would be visible to the player. Semi-transparent textures are overlaid in the foreground in some areas to act as ceiling lights or other features that add an almost unnoticeable degree of detail that just shows how far above and beyond the developers went while creating an aesthetically believable fictional world. The player can freely come and go through almost any door in the level as long as they meet the requirements, and can even navigate through ventilation ducts or hidden passages that connect even more of the world and allow for interesting methods of exploration and stealth. Considering the general setting of Metal Gear Solid, I'm surprised how many of the typical video game environments Konami actually managed to fit into their game's universe. Obviously, their options were limited due to the game's serious, realistic, and militaristic setting, but locations such as the Blast Furnace and the Permafrost Warehouse still fit the same tropes that a lava planet or an ice world would exhibit in other adventure games, even fantastical ones like Super Metroid. This keeps the game's experience from becoming too monotonous and repetitive from staring at cold metallic colors the entire time you're playing. Arguably, Metal Gear Solid's most important impact on the history of video game development was how it solidified the modern experience of a stealth action title, changing the ways players interacted with the environments and characters around them through complex systems of sound effects, predetermined sightlines, and the forced requirements of non-combative gameplay as players quite literally pick their battles to avoid needlessly dangerous circumstances. As any well-guarded enemy base should be equipped with, there are multitudes of security cameras that will alert your foes to Snake's position. Even with these inorganic hazards, the player has a couple of options on how to deal with them. First is to sidle along the wall past the camera's blind spot, and second would be to throw a chaff grenade which disrupts any nearby electronics. Unfortunately, this second method, while sometimes the easiest or only option, also knocks out Snake's own electronics for the time, as evidenced by the minimap being obscured. If guards and other patrolling enemies do notice Snake, you can either incapacitate them however you see fit, or simply avoid them and hide for long enough that they return to their posts. However, being noticed even once can cause several more enemy units to be called into the immediate area, momentarily increasing the game's difficulty. Solid Snake creates more sound when walking on or through louder substances, such as splashing around in water or walking on metal grates. Players can actually use this to their advantage by knocking on surfaces they're leaning against in order to lure nearby guards to a more isolated position. In some areas, such as the nuclear warhead storage building, the player is entirely blocked from using their weapons, so they'll have to find ways to get around with either their fists in close quarters combat or without fighting at all. The most enjoyable instances of Metal Gear Solid's intuitive gameplay comes from whenever the game limits your possibilities. That is when you truly realize how many tools you have at your disposal, and that when you're in control of Solid Snake, you have to think like a stealth operative, knowing exactly what to use in a time of need. I'm of course speaking of the original version of the game and its appropriate ports, and not any versions that allow you to change the camera or anything like that. But whenever something happens to limit your senses, so to speak, then it's important to know how you can get from one place to the other safely. Understanding how to best use dark corners and first-person view, as well as how to taunt enemies and stun cameras, are all important pieces of your mental arsenal that keeps this from becoming a standard shoot-'em-up as players fill the shoes of this one-man army. Available before the game has even begun is a series of optional training missions that introduce the player to all of the basic features and mechanics they'll need to know in order to succeed on their mission. Everything will still be taught to the player should they not attempt these training missions, but it will be more of a challenging learning process when actual progress is on the line. Interestingly enough, the VR training missions don't introduce any combat mechanics, strongly suggesting the player find non-confrontational methods of completing their mission. As for strictly confrontational situations, however, all of the game's boss fights are unique, interesting, and challenging. The main antagonists of Metal Gear Solid all have their own strengths and weaknesses, and the fights are an intentionally structured uphill battle for Snake and the player. In order to succeed against these powerful villains, players have to assess the unique obstacles and limitations presented with each environment, while keeping themselves alive and studying their opponent's behavior succinctly enough to defeat them with limited time and equipment. This has always been a strong suit of the Metal Gear series, but having the ability to outthink the bosses, or even just effectively strategize against them, really displays how well structured these fights are, and keeps them from becoming a mundane grind of shoot them till they're dead. Around the same time that the Metroidvania genre was being established by Castlevania Symphony of the Night, Metal Gear Solid also presented PlayStation fans with an interesting and somewhat similar formula to exploration. Throughout the game, players will slowly gain access to all sorts of different equipment that will allow them to not only open doors with higher security clearance, but also limit or altogether avoid damage from many obstacles they'll face on Shadow Moses Island. From mandatory advances like a new keycard, to minor conveniences like a gas mask that you went out of your way for, these props create new opportunities for exploration to vastly expand the already intricate world of Metal Gear Solid into something worth spending your time in. While the actual dialogue between characters can feel a bit hit or miss in terms of cheesiness, the development of every character in the game is well managed. The main protagonist, multiple antagonists, and several secondary characters all have well-woven relationships and motivations, creating a much more complicated story than could be expected from almost any other game in existence at this point. Sure, there were plenty of story-rich, long-form RPGs, but those stories often weren't much more complex than your typical fairy tale, and had a high bar of entry for players in terms of both free time and attention. While not quite as accessible for all types of players as its 1998 rival, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, Metal Gear Solid presented more hardcore video game consumers with an intense, interesting, and most importantly, high-quality experience that would heavily impact the style and structure of future stealth action adventures like Assassin's Creed, Splinter Cell, and The Last of Us. Both Metal Gear Solid and its direct sequel, Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty, have been featured in the Smithsonian American Art Museum as critical pieces of gaming history. Hideo Kojima's directorial mindset, heavily influenced by Western action films of the 1980s, popularized the use of cinematic camera angles in the game's engine, rather than pre-rendered videos. Prior to this release, many developers had trouble balancing what usually wound up looking like two different styles of graphics, being a lower quality but playable design, and a higher quality cutscene-only design utilized to showcase what limited power was available in one of the world's first disc-based consoles. In fact, the only time the game really stops looking the way it does during general gameplay is during the near-seamless use of real-world footage, presenting Metal Gear Solid's narrative as a more realistically rooted and serious story than can be found in most video games to this day. Upon release, several gaming publications, including PlayStation Official Magazine, IGN, and GamePro, all gave Metal Gear Solid glowing reviews, with several perfect or nearly perfect scores, and often citing this revolutionary stealth action title as an engrossing, unforgettable instant classic. The game went on to win several awards as well in categories regarding its storytelling, graphics, and sound design. The cinematic presentation created an undeniable wake in the gaming world as video games began to be treated more like interactive works of art than a pick-up-and-play hobby. That is what's so great about Metal Gear Solid. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of What's So Great About Gaming, as we took a look at the cinematic world of Metal Gear Solid. Want to see some bonus content? Maybe support the creation of these videos? If so, check out the What's So Great Discord, Twitch, or Patreon. Links for all of those are in the description. If you want to hear what's great about another game, check out the link to our last episode, Pikmin, on screen or in the description. And please take the time to subscribe to be involved in the discussions here. Thanks again for watching. Now go play a great game. We'll see you next time.